Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Social Cohesion and Inclusion National Conference, presenting on the role of leadership in strengthening social cohesion, and also Dr. Brian Adams presenting his reflections on the advancements and lessons learnt around strengthening social cohesion over the past year, as well as the importance of fostering a culture of respect for the diversity that we have in our country. We also officially launched the Creating an Inclusive Narrative publication, which has already formally been given to members of Parliament and made widely available to a broad range of civil society organisations, the media and the broader public. Today we have a panel who will share their reflections on being engaged in the inclusive narrative roundtables, which led to this publication. And also they will share their own thoughts on pathways for action that are vital in reaching higher levels of cohesion in the country. Please put your questions in the Q&A box for the panelists as the panel session is happening. So this Q&A box can be accessed at the bottom of your screen. The panel will be followed by a breakout into discussion groups where you will look at those areas identified in the Creating an Inclusive Narrative publication that require urgent attention to advance and strengthen social cohesion. And I will explain in more detail at the end of the panel session how we're going to make this transition into the breakout rooms. But first, I wish to introduce my dear colleague, Venus Kalesi, whose key focus in the Australian Baha'i community is on the engagement of the media in public discourse and has been part of the Creating an Inclusive Narrative project. She will be moderating today's panel, and I hand it over to her to introduce our panelists for today.
I'm delighted to be introducing each of our panelists this morning, who'll be offering their reflections on the Creating an Inclusive Narrative project, particularly as we give focus to the section titled Pathways for Action, as highlighted in the Creating an Inclusive Narrative publication. Now, as I introduce each of our panelists, I might ask them to wave so that the conference participants are able to connect with each of you. So I'm delighted to introduce firstly Amy Churchouse, who is the founder of the Good Karma Effect. Amy grew up in Wellington, New Zealand, and similar to all of our panelists today, she comes from a wide spectrum of life experiences. By the age of 30, Amy had a Bachelor of Sports Science and Psychology and explored a number of different industries and roles. Then, at 31, Amy decided to follow her childhood dream of becoming a vet. After 5 years of vet school, she moved to Melbourne in 2015 to start her veterinary career. After experiencing some challenges in her own life and in witnessing the suffering in the lives of those around her, and of course being a natural problem solver, Amy decided she wanted to try and make a difference and help people have better lives. She wanted to give others the opportunity to do the same. Amy started KGKN, which stands for Kensington Good Karma Network, to help people help each other, and so the Good Karma Effect was born. We also have joining us today Dr. Chrisanthi Giotis, who is a postdoctoral research fellow with the Centre for Media Transition at the University of Technology in Sydney. Chrisanthi's work focuses on changing journalism practice to promote marginalised voices. As a working journalist, she covered Indigenous issues in the Dubbo area, and as an academic, her reporting on marginalised young people in Western Sydney won her the UTS Dame Mary Gilmore Prize for Journalism. More recently, Chrisanthi has worked with the Congolese refugees, seeking their input before reporting on refugee camps in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This led to her current postdoctoral position at the Centre for Media Transition, examining best practice journalism at the global local interface and how this relates to trust in the media. Her current research project is entitled Teaching Each Other Trust in the Fake News Era. Recently, Chrisanthi was awarded the 2020 Journalism, Education and Research Association of Australia Research Grant. We also have joining us today Dr. Kirk Zwangobani, who is the chair of the Australian Capital Territory Multicultural Advisory Council. Kirk works as a humanities executive teacher in Canberra and as an early career researcher. In his doctorate research, Kirk theorised extensively on the emergence of an African Australian identity and experiences of belonging amongst youth, working across a number of fields, including post-colonialism, philosophy, cultural studies, and education. Kirk is a member of the ACT Multicultural Youth Affairs Network. He is also a fellow with the Australian Council for Educational Leadership and is currently serving as the ACT President and as a National Director. Kirk chairs the ACT Multicultural Advisory Council and is responsible for advising the ACT Minister for Multicultural Affairs. And finally, we have Dr. Zeny Edwards, who is the Vice President and Director for Community Engagement of World Citizens Association of Australia. Zeny has an Order of Australia medal and is an architectural historian, an award-winning biographer, and cultural heritage advocate. She has previously served as President of the National Trust of Australia for New South Wales, as the Chair of the New South Wales branch for UN Women Australia, the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women, the Trustee of Women's Plans Foundation, and Vice President of the Institute for Global Peace and Sustainable Governance. Amongst her many current roles, Zeny is a member of the Management Committee of the Australian Council for Human Rights Education. She is a Goodwill Ambassador of the Institute for Economics and Peace and is a staunch advocate for advancing community cohesion in Australia, most recently serving as a member of the Creating an Inclusive Narrative Advisory Board. A very warm welcome to each of our panelists today. We're very grateful to be drawing from your experiences and insights as we move through today's discussions. Well, today's conversation will be an exploration of ideas, similar to the approach taken during the roundtable discussions, which were actually quite an intrinsic part of this project. Today's panelists are invited to draw on each other's thinking and build on each other's ideas as we advance our collective understanding together. Now, given that each of you had the opportunity to engage in this project as a participant of the roundtables, why don't we start with sharing what that was like? How do you see our society drawing on these types of settings that are framed around the concept of consultation, particularly in drawing on the principles of dialogue, which helped us shape the roundtables and which are used as a tool that can help strengthen social cohesion? Who would like to begin?
Thank you very much, Venus, for that welcome. And can I just acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the, well, I'm meeting on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I just want to mention that also because I'm at Sydney Uni. So if you hear some loud students in the background, please forgive me. My quiet spot has gotten a bit busier. And I think that's a good way to start, because you see this, like, when people have time, they love to engage in dialogue. And that was one of the things that the process gifted people, really, I think, is that opportunity to be engaged in dialogue and to engage in dialogue knowing that this is the reason that they were coming to the dialogue. And I feel like one of the things that we forget in our society, which is so busy, is that actually we do need to make space to reflect. And one of the gorgeous things about the many difficulties that we faced post-COVID or in the new COVID world is having to rebuild that social capital in neighborhoods, which your report highlights so wonderfully. And I think that drawing on the principles of the consultation process and on the principles of dialogue, and acknowledging each other in that very dialogic way as human beings with lots of respect for each other's point of view, is something that maybe we can take into those neighborhood settings, so that we understand that we're doing more than cleaning the verge of grass. It's not just about that. It's not just that transactional aspect, but it's also about just the opportunity to connect and have conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the opportunity to be able to explore thought in a way that's respectful is becoming increasingly a need in our society, particularly given that the prevalence of technology and the way in which, you know, certain platforms might veer conversations in a certain direction. Kirk, I think you also had your hand up. I want to throw it over to you now. What was the process like for you, and how do you see this, the principles of dialogue now helping to be used as a tool that can strengthen social cohesion?
Yeah, look, I thoroughly enjoyed the panel, the process, I should say. You know, I had to try and sort of zip it a few times because I found myself wanting to jump in quite often. So, you know, at times of those those sort of exchanges, you've really got to sort of learn to, as a participant, to also listen and reflect on what others are saying. You know, I think that's the beauty of what we're even doing here today. What first came to mind for me, though, when I saw this question was, you know, I'm a teacher in a school, and I'm at school at the moment, and I teach a unit sort of course called Global Studies, which focuses on, you know, equipping young people with the skills, the thinking, the understanding, the relationships to be able to collaborate in terms of to face the challenges that we now face as a planet now and into the future. And one of the actual key units in that is a unit on democracy. And we have very robust discussions in the classroom about participatory or direct democracy. And I guess this process really reminded me of what a lot of quarters in society are actually calling for, that we, you know, currently have a lot of disengagement, disenfranchisement with people. And this is sort of in some ways with politics and political discourses, but it's also about, you know, having discussions and decisions about what affect us on, you know, in our everyday lives. You know, I've chatted with Natalie before, Mavini, about how, you know, we're sort of in a post-politics sphere, but I still think that, you know, that sort of forms of participatory democracy, direct democracy, doesn't necessarily have to actually be about politics. I think it's about, as we're doing here, having a discussion and actually working out how we can engage with those forces and those institutions and influence them that actually affect our lives. And I think this sort of dialogic process is pivotal to that. I don't think it can actually happen without that. You know, it works in different ways, and sometimes it's effective and sometimes we're sort of left wondering, but that's also part of the expectations, I would say. You know, one of the ideas I teach in class is a local candidate, Tim Hollow, I think he runs for the Greens, but he's wrote some essays on what they call the commons, as a different form of approach to political systems, to democracy, to how communities can actually live and work together. And, you know, his idea of the commons is very much about communities, let's say where I live here or where I'm teaching here in the north of Canberra, actually getting together and having discussions about what affects them and how they can influence the decision makers or be part of the decision making process. So, you know, exactly what we're really doing here today and exactly what the initial discussions were about, which of course eventuated in this brilliant report that we've all had a look at.
Thank you, Kurt. Zeny, I'm seeing a lot of nodding from your end. I'd love to hear what it was like, you know, being a participant in these roundtables, and of course then drawing on the principles of consultation as an advisory board member who really had the opportunity to reflect deeply now on some of the salient features of the contributions that came through from these roundtables. How do you see this process of dialogue now shaping the future of social cohesion in our country?
Thank you, Venus. It was really an enlightening thing. It's amazing how much you learn something new from everybody, no matter what you think you sort of say, oh, I've known all of this all along, but there's always some new insight and some new input. And I attribute that to the roundtables that have occurred. So what I gathered from that is that you actively sought a resource to equal access to diverse people. So that was to me a very crucial point in the roundtables, is the equal access to diverse people. And also a recognition that Australian communities are made up of different governance structures and different ways of governing the population and different ways of engaging with the population. And that to me was quite a learning experience for me, because more or less in what I do, I have this set mindset of I have to do this way and I have to do this way. But there are many pathways, and there are many creative pathways to engaging with different um, attitudes and different opinions in a very democratic way, but in a very respectful and non-judgmental way. And I think those two things are the sort of the foundation of a good dialogue and a good democratic system. So to me, that was the multi-levels of discourse was the most important part of the roundtables, and also the atmosphere and the whole attitude of respect, trust, and the working together and hearing what everybody is saying without judgment and without just accepting it. It's not tolerance, but just accepting it in a non-judgmental way. It's almost like a unconditional way of saying, okay, you've got something to say, I accept that. Even if I don't agree with it, I respect your attitude and what you have to say. So yes, everybody was equal, and to me that was my most important take from those roundtables.
Yeah. There was certainly the expression, having a place at the table really came to life, didn't it, during these roundtables, because everyone's contributions were given equal weight, and the opportunity to really explore truth together came to life through this experience. And I have to say that as someone that was also engaged in this process, the warmth of spirit and that shared love for the future of our country, and even for our shared humanity, was a very unique aspect of the spirit that animated these roundtables each and every time. Amy, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well about this question before we do move on to the section about pathways for action, which Zeny referenced. What was it like for you? And how do you now see these principles of consultation being an opportunity and being used as a tool which can help to strengthen social cohesion?
Well, I think that the basics of cohesion is really about breaking down barriers. And how do we break down barriers? There's such great diversity, even in the people of the same ethnicity, the people of the same sexuality. There is huge diversity in those places, and every one of us has a completely unique journey. And I've heard across the people at our panel speaking of things that draw people together, and there is this common humanity. And when we create safe places where everybody is equal because they're human, then none of the other stuff matters. And as soon as somebody feels safe and connected and valuable, then we have cohesion. And what happens then? What happens then is we are able to see each other much more easily. We can actually see difference, and we can embrace that difference for the value that it brings to our lives and to our ecosystems, our workplaces, our communities. And so I think that the principles are really, really the principle of dialogue are really important. I think we can get very caught up in jargon and technicalities and democracy and deliberative this and that, and I think for lots of people that's actually quite alienating. Some people can't engage with those words, and when they don't feel like they can connect with them, it can be exclusive. So I think that's important for us to really join on that emotional state of that raw humanity. And I think that's definitely one of the, the parts of this process that was so valuable and certainly felt so good to me was just that creating a safe place where everybody was equal. Then all of a sudden you could learn about all of the other places and all of the other people in a way that enlightened you and allowed you insight that could help you move forward with whatever your awareness is. And I mean, we all have a different awareness. As inclusive as all of us would like to think we are, there's still things we don't know. There's still things we haven't seen and places we haven't been. And all of those places, somebody has been, and it has been a part of somebody's valuable and potentially challenging but profound journey. And that is when you can reach out and say to people, I value your experience here on the planet. Please bring it and share it with me. Then you have connection and you can do pretty much anything together. So yeah, I felt very, very good about the process, and I look forward to, finding a way for us to really simplify the principles of this dialogue so that it can enter into all of our spaces, because they're all different. You can't say this one's going to work for this one and that one. We want to simplify it so we can actually just be together and go forward together.
Yeah, well, look, on that note, and maybe before we do move on to the talking about the pathways for action, which were a key contribution from the roundtables, because those pathways were actually expressions that came through from them. I was just wondering if any of you would like to speak to an example of some of the new ways of thinking that you took away from the roundtables themselves.
One of the things that I really found quite interesting about in terms of taking away an insight was the fact that we can take strength from crises. We usually think of crises as something negative, and, in my own profession, in the media particularly, we talk about the economic crisis and how it sort of led a race to the bottom. And certainly in terms of social cohesion, that's often been the case, because outrage is monetizable on digital platforms in a way that inclusive reporting is not. However, crises have also allowed an opportunity for the media to shine and to highlight the constructive role that the media can play. So I think that's sort of like the general positive, the willingness of people to find the positive aspects in this time of hardship has been really, really an amazing insight. The other thing that I found so heartening was the role of philosophy, actually, which was what Kirk highlighted as well, to be able to talk about philosophy, to talk about philosophical principles in the roundtables, and to be able to talk about it in a way that wasn't, ivory tower at all. That was very practical, and could be applied in that space was, for me, a great insight, and it helped me think about the way that we can find our fellow travelers in this space and talk to them.
Yeah, look, I might jump in on that as well. I mean, I think for me, the beauty of the process and the round tables was that, I had a lot of questions that I was still wondering about, things that I was still hadn't had the time, I guess, to delve deeper into. And I know that everyone was sort of talking about learning from each other. And so I was fortunate enough to have a human rights commissioner on my round table. And, some of the rights approaches to the work that I do in terms of, let's say, anti-racism or anything along those lines. But I, for me, it was something I actually wanted to explore, but hadn't had that opportunity to. So rather than in isolation going off and trying to do some research and so forth, I, was able to actually just ask that question of the commissioner, and it took us into a different space and a different discussion. But it immediately just answered questions for me that really been back in the back of my mind, especially in the multicultural council space for a couple of years, because we always have discussions about rights-based approaches to social cohesion or equality and equity and so forth. So again, it's just that opportunity to meet with people, and for you to actually really to reflect deeply, but ask those questions of things that you aren't sure about, that you don't know, which I think is what Amy just said. There are things we don't know. And that's the best thing about this sort of process, is being able to explore those with other people.
Can I build on that one too, Kirk?
Sure.
obviously, we've brought together, hundreds of people from diverse backgrounds, and what we've had the opportunity to do, and I look forward to seeing what is possible beyond here, is what are the strengths of the other people around the round tables that we could add to our repertoire of moving forward in a way that benefits everybody. And because none of us have everything, and this is the whole point of cohesion and inclusion, is that together we have everything. By ourselves we only have ourselves, we only have our life experience and all of the things that we have done and the skills we have, and that makes everybody else incredibly valuable to us. And as soon as you realize that and embrace it, then what could we do? Can you imagine?
Absolutely. There's this really beautiful expression about the constellation of capacities that are heightened when we do come together. And it's sort of reminds me as well about the quote that's shared on the first page of this publication about how just as the richest ecosystems are those marked by their biodiversity, so too societies have the potential to be made stronger by their cultural diversity. And I think that even goes beyond cultural diversity to our interdisciplinary experiences, our life experiences, as you've mentioned, Amy. So there's something quite profound here about that constellation of capacities and that coming together, which really strengthens and enriches the process of building greater degrees of social cohesion in our country. Well, this panel has a particular focus looking at the pathways for action, which is found from page 17 of the Inclusive Narrative publication. And these, as I mentioned, were identified during the roundtables themselves. And they've been offered in the narrative publication for sincere consideration and are described here as an opportunity for everyone to learn how we can make significant yet achievable steps forward and build the collective capacity required to lay the foundations of a society that can address current and unforeseen challenges, demanding urgent attention during this time of uncertainty and change. So then, moving on to the actual pathways themselves. These were identified, as I mentioned, during the roundtables and included building resilient communities, an appreciation for neighbourhood settings for intense learning about social cohesion, ensuring the meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples, redefining the purpose of education, drawing on the true purpose of religion, fostering new models of leadership, and rethinking the role of the media. So now, taking inspiration from this section of the publication and in drawing on your own range of experiences, both at the organisational level and in the context of your own neighbourhoods, which pathways for action from this narrative document do you consider to be vital as we work towards greater degrees of social cohesion in our country, and what is their significance? So, Kirk, I might firstly throw it over to you.
Okay, so look, I'll talk about two, I guess. In terms of organisation, obviously I'll talk a little bit about the advisory council. And when you talk about neighbourhoods, what for me came to mind, obviously, because I'm a teacher in school and spend a lot of time in schools, that this is in many ways my neighbourhood. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well, because that sort of steers into the idea of rethinking education or reshaping education. In terms of the models for leadership, like, I guess what we do as a council really speaks quite clearly, I think, to what the inclusive narrative is really saying. As a council, we actually get together and we always discuss what are the pathways for actions we can take to actually improve the outcomes for multicultural communities in Canberra. And that's basically what we're here to do, or at least to advise the Minister on what are some of the best ways forward. We're guided by a framework that talks about, accessible and responsive services and civic participation and social cohesion, capitalising on cultural diversity. And it all seems a little bit like rhetoric when you see it on paper and in a policy. But I think the idea of leadership is actually having more diverse voices actually informing what we do. And I know for a long time we've been struggling to really try and lift the bar in that area in particular. to actually have that diversity, that sort of interaction of different views, different opinions, as well as different cultures, different races, and again, if you stretch over to gender and ability and so forth. I think that for me, the leadership in particular, the role that the council plays in trying to actually foster a more intact policy and legislation. I mean, and I won't say unfortunately, but obviously leadership very much comes down to how well policies and legislation are enacted, especially when you're advising the minister. Part of what we've been fighting for example, here in the ACT is to have what we do as a council put into legislation. And so by having those robust discussions with the minister's office, with bureaucrats, consulting with the community, having this sort of open dialogue has allowed us to actually push forward, where we've just had a recent election where they've actually agreed to actually recognise what we do in legislation. So in that sense, it's sort of, I guess, part of that model for leadership is really just bringing to the table the lived experience of diverse people, so it's actually properly represented in policy and in legislation. For me, that's long and the short of what we actually do as a council, to make sure that whatever is done at a policy level or at a legislative level really actually has influence, has impact, and reflects lived experience. Because I think before, it's quite often others that are making those decisions that may not actually be part of the lived experience of multicultural communities, of diversity, and so forth. So I guess that's, for me, definitely where leadership needs to go. I sometimes joke that, we used to call it policy paralysis, where organisations could not create policies to take action because of the leadership. Now I think the leadership has stepped up, and we do have a lot of policy there that speaks to diversity, that speaks to social cohesion and so forth. But now I joke it's a matter of practice paralysis, that even though the policies are there, it's how we actually follow through and take action and actually make sure that those policies and legislations are actually effective. So I think we're still working our way through in our leadership how we get to that in particular. If I jump to education,
Yes, no, I think that's quite profound what you've shared there about the role of leadership and why it's of significance. I'm also mindful that we still are yet to go to the Q&A questions. So just to ensure that equitable opportunity is given to all of our panelists, I'm going to now ask Amy, and maybe let's just express one of the pathways to action, because I'm sure actually they're all of significance here, but it's also helpful to understand, as you mentioned, Kirk, why that translates into a practical expression of significance. So thank you for noting the significance of the role of leadership as a pathway for action. Amy, what was of significance for you in terms of these pathways and why?
I think the leadership one is an interesting one, and I'm going to be in the building resilient communities breakout session, because that's the space that I work in. However, I feel like it's really important that we actually embrace the concept of leadership in terms of evolving that, because we've always had this kind of top-down approach, and if we actually took a different approach to it, and we talked about empowerment and collaboration and facilitation rather than leadership as such, then it would feel more inclusive for some people and more accessible. So that was just something I wanted to tack on the end of Kirk's sort of robust piece about leadership. But yeah, building resilient communities is so important, and it speaks to the whole thing. Is if everybody feels a part of it, then we have everything and we can do anything. So that's as simple as it really needs to be. So the key is to make everybody feel safe, valuable, connected, and beyond that, there's a great opportunity for us if we're building those resilient communities. Well, they are resilient if we do that. Okay.
Zeny, which pathway to action spoke to you and why?
Education is a very big thing for me, and also educating ourselves to challenge stereotypes and a lack of diversity in the workplace and our community. There is a myriad of ways for us to utilize our own privilege. I mean, we as a panel have that myriad of ways for us to utilize our own privilege. You have given us the voice to do that. So we need to actively educate ourselves and or seek out education on marginalized groups in our community, in our country, in our workplace. Connect with the champions in existing structures. It's time for us to make use of those who are already championing diversity and social inclusion. We do this through networking, connecting, and banding together to help raise awareness and help the message to echo out into our communities and workspaces. First of all, we must have good leadership. Our leaders should stand on a set of values and beliefs because ultimately they will be judged by them. We expect them to have the highest standard of conduct and integrity and live the values that they espouse to the public. Diversity is always a very sensitive thing in government, especially. It always sparks debate on what is right and what is wrong, or how many of diverse cultures should I have in the ministry and all this. And diversity is often embraced only in name and not in norms. So we need to have a cultural change in mindset among our leaders to remove the defensiveness about diversity.
Okay.
Hard to do for now, but I think we're getting there slowly but surely.
Okay. Thank you for those encouraging words, Zeny. Chrisanthi, which pathway for action spoke to you, and how do you see its significance on this roadmap towards strengthening social cohesion?
Obviously, all of them spoke to me, but I'm going to speak about rethinking the role of the media because that's where I think I can most value add to this discussion. And for me, what I see as crucial, so in the document, the question is asked, can the media take a greater share of responsibility in advancing and safeguarding social cohesion and in the context that they produce their media? And I really want to highlight that word responsibility because I think it's key. This isn't actually alien to the media. In the past, the media did take on a responsible role. So I remember the day after Pauline Hanson's maiden speech, I was 16 at the time, and the Sydney Morning Herald had a front page editorial titled, "We Are a Mongrel Nation." And the thrust of it was we should relish our diversity and be proud of it because that's what makes us stronger, you know? And so that was a front page editorial in response to Pauline Hanson's maiden speech. And you see how far we've come the other way, you know? And so I guess for me, there is a really important role for the media to rethink its leadership aspect, you know, coming back to leadership. However, it can't do it alone. And one of the things that has happened since 1996 is that we now live a media life. All of us are media producers. And so when we're talking about responsibility, that's actually onto all of us as well, to not send out that angry tweet. And this is where media literacy and education also comes into it as well, and building that culture of respect from a very early age. However, I think, yeah, a focus on the responsibility aspect, it will help with the social cohesion, and also it will help people to pursue truth, because one of the other features of our modern media landscape is that in Australia, 62% of people actively try to avoid the news. So at least occasionally, either occasionally, sometimes or often, 62% actually try to avoid the news, and that's actually more prevalent in youth. And so that's actually very frightening. And one of the main reasons that they do that is because they don't feel that the news empowers them. So there again, you see that responsibility. There are other forms of reporting that can be more empowering. You know, there's a constructive journalism movement on the way at the moment. And so, yeah, this is where we can, again, take up a bit of a mantle of responsibility as a media industry. But I think it is up to the audiences as well, because audiences would be surprised how much they drive media.
Okay. Thank you. Look, I note the time, and we've had a lot of questions come through from our Q&A. So I might move now into that section and share with you some of the questions that we've received. These have been sent on my phone, so that's why I am looking down at my phone now while I speak to all of you. One of the questions here is, how can the average person create these spaces for dialogue in their local area? So any thoughts around that?
Look, I'll jump in just quickly. Going back to school, I mean, what we did most recently with was students sort of convened a panel, and again, it's sort of in this political space, but again, it's what I'm sort of the area that I teach. But it just took collaboration between a local church across the road, some interested parents of the community that actually thought it'd be good for us to actually really just question the candidates in the upcoming election about environmental policy. It was quite simple, it was quite straightforward. We hadn't done it before, but it just needed someone to have the idea, and then all of us to contribute the energy to make it work. And you know, there was a lot of young people in the audience, probably 20 to 30 young people, plus maybe another 10 or 20 adults due to COVID. But it just opened up a very rich discussion prior to the elections. And again, I'm sort of in this political space, but again, just took collaboration and idea and the energy to make it work. That's on a larger sort of political space, but it's quite possible and quite easy. I've had numerous examples where that's what it comes down to.
The purpose is really important. Why are you doing what you're doing, and therefore who are you inviting, and how do they feel about it? You know, obviously to walk into your community and go, I'd like everybody to come around and sit around a table and have a chat, could be quite, you know, sort of like more scary. So I think that, you know, that purpose, obviously you had a purpose there, Kirk, for that event. And, you know, it could be as simple as having a neighborhood barbecue. You know, we're creating a safe space for us to come together, be together and share our stories of COVID, you know, or whatever, some common experience. For me, connection is always the key to breaking down barriers. Where as soon as people feel, you know, connected, then they can share and actually hear people much more openly. And I think that's a very important aspect of bringing people together, cohesive ecosystems and environments.
Okay. Another question that's been, oh, sorry, Chrisanthi, did you want to speak to that?
Very quickly, I would say use the social capital that already exists. So, you know, maybe your purpose in going to the men's shed is to talk about what role can men have in helping young men, you know, navigate their way through these turbulent times, especially with education systems changing. Or you go to a local women's group at a mosque or something, and you talk about their issues of Islamophobia, and you're asked to open that conversation out in a respectful way to the wider community.
Okay. Well, the next question that we've received looks to the role of institutions in creating an inclusive narrative. They've said here, for example, an organisation, university, government body. Kirk, what are your thoughts around this?
I thought he sort of tried to tackle that one a little bit earlier. I just think it's lived experience again. Like, I think that I worked with a couple of government agencies as well, and it's just about hearing, I think, what was really important for them in terms of influencing leadership was just hearing the stories of members of their staff from diverse backgrounds, their experiences that they've had in the organisation. It might be to do with sexism, racism, it might be positive experiences around social cohesion and, the sense of community they get in the workplace. But what I found with that endeavour, facilitating that process, was it really was about just actually, again, for me, I think is sacrosanct, is that the organisations understand the lived experience of those people that are part of that organisation. It depends what it's there for and what its vision is and what its aims are, or its purpose. But the best results I've seen in organisations is where the members of that organisation have a voice and are able to share their experiences and then work through ways to resolve some of the dilemmas or some of the difficulties and issues they might face, or to leverage the successes that they've had in terms of building a cohesive community within an organisation.
Yeah, that's so important. It sort of reminds me of the need to heighten consciousness about, the social challenges or the obstacles or even those experiences. And then also coupled with the need to recognise that, irrespective of the institution or the organisation, at that level, they're also protagonists in this process, and have a complementary role to play as well. Did anyone have any thoughts to share in addition to what Kirk's mentioned here about the role of institutions in creating an inclusive narrative?
I think, for example, Sydney Festival is holding a program holding a lesson in learning a local language. So small things like that, and some schools are also introducing the sort of the instruction how to learn some words, indigenous words like the Wiradjuri and Gamilaroi and all of these ancient languages, which are more ancient than the ancient languages of Latin or Greek. So some schools are adopting that, and also the introduction of the First Nation studies into the school curriculum. I think that's very important. There's some heritage festivals with the National Trust, for example, that celebrate Indigenous culture, and Multicultural Day is celebrated in schools, and I think that should continue and be enriched.
Okay. Well, another question that we received from the Q&A are, what are some challenges that you feel will need to be overcome to help bring people together to explore such important questions, and how can these challenges be addressed?
I think leadership and the media, they have a very powerful role in encouraging people to speak up and to disseminate this information, and wanting to engage and working together towards social cohesion. Social media, for example, is also a very powerful tool. But in the end, I think it's our leadership. The government has to initiate these, because they dictate to us how we should behave in society and how we should live our lives, because that's the structure of our government. So I think that's very important, but we need to empower ourselves and not rely on talking down to people and leaders talking down to people. That is very important. And for the media to please report on factual analysis rather than opinion, because that to me is the swaying factor. It's not a sport. Media reporting shouldn't be a sport. It should be a reporting of factual analysis so that we get the facts rather than what they want us to hear.
Chrisanthi, please.
Yeah, if I can just quickly add on that media role, one of the big challenges, I think, is polarization. So I think that there's a real fear now sometimes to engage in topics of depth for fear of it's going to result in a shouting match or, people's opinions. We're told that we live in a very polarized society. And if you are on social media, that's the way the world looks. I don't think that's actually true. I think that most people are actually not polarized, and there's a big center that is very keen to be socially cohesive society and really aims for that. So yeah, but the view is that it's hard to talk about issues of significance because you're just going to get attacked.
Yeah, look, oh, sorry.
I was just going to speak to a couple of things that were coming up there. It was our collective responsibility for, our working towards a cohesive society is, everybody's got to play their part, and the government can't do it on their own. The organisations can't do it on their own. What we do have is control over how we engage with anybody in our lives, and that is actually the only thing that we can control. So if we took self-responsibility, if everybody collectively took individual responsibility for their engagement and moved in a direction of cohesive engagement, then we would start to see much more compassionate connections, much more opportunity for hearing each other's different experiences, and then those breaking down of barriers that would bring us together, and then everybody could play their part. And this is the thing, is there's a big jigsaw puzzle in our world with huge amounts of diversity of all sorts of types, and we can't say it's anybody's individual responsibility, and it's not the media's responsibility, obviously. The more we are together, the more likely we are to also be able to identify things that are not true, that are not serving us, and be able to make decisions together about what we want to do about that.
Yeah, look, I'll pick up on that as well. Like, I think on all the points that were just made, for me, working with young people, one of the biggest factors is obviously fear. It's the uncertainty, it's the fear of the future. It's a lot of that is fed, obviously, like Zeny already mentioned, from media, like Christia said about polarization. Young people are just fed this, and they digest it. It has a significant effect on them and their lives. I think in terms of how do we get past that? Yes, education does have responsibility, very much. I think it's about, and we in very robust discussions now in educational circles about how we tackle a lot of these global challenges, a lot of the uncertainty, a lot of the fear that young people face. I think you're right, Amy. It is about a collective responsibility. It is about coming from that sort of not being directed from top down about how we address a lot of this. But look, I think most of all, what I find with young people, and I guess this speaks to where we are today, is it's about the narrative. I think they really just need they're creating, but they also sort of look for a very strong narrative that gives them the permission almost, or the possibility and the opportunity to actually have these discussions, to enact change, to take action on those things that matter to them. I mean, the panel that we had with the politicians, because young people were not scared, but the uncertainty of climate change. What can we actually do about it? What are those people in charge doing about it? We want to ask some difficult questions so we can be clear in our own minds what we can do, or what the way going forward is. So they want to shape, they want to influence the narrative, they want to create their own narrative. So I think the narrative for young people, especially with polarization, the neoliberalism failure, and all these big ideas they deal with and they hear about, is they're looking for what comes next. What's the next narrative that gives them that ability to be empowered?
Okay, well, thank you all so much for lending your thoughts to our discussions today, and the rich insights that you've offered through the wealth of your experience. No doubt we could continue exploring so many of the questions that have been sent to us, and that's really what the purpose of the breakout sessions are. So we will continue this journey together, not only today, but I'm sure over time, as we expand our thinking and take strides together in heightening the social cohesion of our country. Now, before we do move to the next part of this morning's session, may I convey my deep gratitude for the hope and vision which animated our roundtables and podcast recordings, thanks to the generosity of spirit of individuals such as yourselves. This process has really offered so much hope for the future of our country, in the sense that there is this strong and growing band of Australians in a community of protagonists throughout our country who are truly committed to this process of creating an inclusive narrative for our country, and the sincerity of your engagement and our ongoing exchanges about the type of future that we can all share together has been truly inspiring. So on that note, I'd like to now hand it back to Ida, who will lead us through the next part of today's program. Thank you once again to each of you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to Venus so much for that session. It was really deeply helpful in advancing our understanding and getting a good picture of what the roundtables were like. And I really enjoyed how each of the panelists built on each other's ideas, and it really was reflective of what the roundtables felt like, and it was wonderful to engage in those types of roundtables as well, because you really felt like you were learning from one another. So thank you for showing how we can do it in a panel session at a conference as well. So now we're going to break out into our discussion groups, and I hope you all had a really enriching experience listening to the panel as well. Okay, thank you.